I'm really thrilled that Ben Goldfarb is with us today. Ben's a really interesting person. I decided, I was telling Ben that I decided I really wanted Ben to come to campus as I was waiting for my son to run a track race last February and was reading his book on road ecology and said, I just think I would like to meet this guy. And I hope that he would come, and he did, and I'm really grateful for that. Ben is from Hudson Valley, New York. He's a graduate of Amherst College in Massachusetts, as well as doing a graduate degree at the Yale School of the Environment. He has worked as a field ecologist. He worked for the National Park Service in Yellowstone. He's tagged sea turtles. He is currently a journalist with a number of very high-profile outlets. He started as a journalist for High Country News. He writes for National Geographic, for The Atlantic, for The New Yorker. His recent book, which came out last year, is Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. And today's talk will lean heavily on much of the research he did for that book. Ben Goldfarb lives in Salida, Colorado, with his wife and dog. He's been to Utah many times looking at wildlife crossings and other things, but this is his first time to Provo. Please join me in welcoming Ben Goldfarb to P-Late.
Thank you so much, Quinn, for that introduction. Thanks to everyone who is involved in this lecture series and is having me out today. Thanks to all of you for being here. I so appreciate seeing a packed room. That means a lot. So today I'll be talking about the ecological impacts of highways and the science of road ecology, which is this relatively small but fast-growing discipline that looks at all of the different ways that roads interact with and transform nature. And roads are so transformative in large part because there are just so many of them, right? How many miles of road do we have in the United States? Somebody just throw a number out there. How many roads are we talking about here? Any guesses? 4 million. Wow, somebody read the book maybe. So we've got about 4 million miles of road in the U.S. How many millions of miles of road globally? Any guesses there? Around, that's not a bad guess. It feels that way in some places. We've got around 40 million miles of road worldwide, and around 15 million miles more essentially under construction. We're in this period that ecologists have called the infrastructure tsunami, this wave of new highways and rail lines and fiber optic cables and other infrastructure that's sweeping the planet. So we've got a lot of roads and a lot more coming, and I think it's worth taking a moment to reflect on where those roads came from. How did we end up with so many roads? Where did they originate? And I think that one of the ironies of roads impacting nature is that in some ways roads have their origins in nature. So many of our roads began as animal trails, in many cases created by bison, the largest bodied and most numerous migratory mammal in North America, who, through their sagacious selection of the most sure and direct courses influenced the routes of trade and travel, right? Animal trails became Native American footpaths, which became wagon and horse roads, which became gravel roads, which became federal highways. I find that, again, kind of ironic to contemplate that roads and nature have always interacted to some extent. And I think because this conversation today is part of this larger lecture series on colonial legacies, I also think it's worth reflecting on the colonial origins of our road system. Before the Bureau of Public Roads was created in the early 1900s, followed by our modern Federal Highway Administration, many roads in the 19th century were built or improved by the U.S. Army, which created roads to open up the interior of the continent for agriculture and timber harvest and the fur trade and other industrial uses. And of course, those roads were also instrumental in dispossessing native people of their land and wiping out the bison that native people depended on, and which again created our roads to some extent. As John Calhoun put it, roads existed to conquer space. They were the implements or the instruments of colonialism from their very inception. And of course, in the 20th century, as roads proliferated, first with the creation of Bureau of Public Roads, the first federal agency that maintained and improved roads, followed by the interstate highway system in the mid-20th century, roads obtained these powerful cultural connotations, right? They were these symbols of human mobility and momentum. You know, Bruce Springsteen sang about them, right? Jack Kerouac wrote about them. Roads, the open road, especially these new interstate highways, you know, were the ultimate symbols of human freedom and mobility, which is somewhat, again, ironic, a word I'm going to use a lot throughout this conversation today, because the same freedom and mobility and momentum that our giant new highways provided human beings, they denied other animals on a truly mind-boggling scale. That's I-70, by the way, the major interstate through Colorado where I live. And of course, the most conspicuous, obvious way that roads and wildlife interact and roads curtail animal journeys is through roadkill, right? You know, we've all seen the carcass by the side of the highway. Here's a question for you guys. How many vertebrate animals, so just backboned animals, right? We're not talking about insects or arachnids here. How many vertebrate animals are killed by cars in the U.S., let's say every day? Any guesses? 50,000, good guess. The number's a bit higher. In fact, there are more than 1 million animals killed by cars every single day in the United States. And again, a lot of those are sort of smaller-bodied things, birds, rodents, reptiles, amphibians, stuff that you don't necessarily see, which I think is why that number is so much larger than people realize. And of course, logically enough, a lot of those animals are common critters, you know, raccoons, white-tailed deer, gray squirrels, right? We've all seen those critters. And because the animals that we most commonly notice on the highway are the most common animals, I think we tend to downplay roadkill as a conservation crisis, right? But in fact, dozens of federally threatened and endangered species, from Florida panthers to tiger salamanders to Hawaiian geese, have roadkill as their primary source of mortality, right? We're in the middle of this 6th mass extinction event in our planet's history, and we're literally driving many of those species to extinction. And in fact, as Richard Foreman, one of the founders of the discipline of road ecology, has observed, roadkill is today the leading direct human cause of vertebrate mortality on land, which is a fancy scientific way of saying there's nothing that we do, literally nothing that we do, that kills more wild animals than drive. And I think that one of the things that makes roadkill so pernicious as a conservation problem is the way that it subverts and you might say carjacks evolution, right? You think about the defense mechanisms of so many of our most common beloved critters, turtles that withdraw into their shells, or skunks that spray, or porcupines that bristle their quills. These are all kind of stand your ground, hunker down defense mechanisms that worked really well for thousands of generations against wolves and cougars and other natural predators. But when your predator is an F-150 barreling down I-80 at 70 miles an hour, the worst possible thing you can do is hunker down and withdraw into your shell, right? So roadkill takes evolutionary history and renders it not only moot, but actually maladaptive. I find that kind of tragic to contemplate. So roadkill, again, is probably the most conspicuous or obvious way that we encounter these interactions between roads and nature. But they're really just the tip of the iceberg, and road ecology looks at all of these different relationships and connections. Roads are vectors of invasive species, right? So many non-native plants and animals basically penetrate ecosystems along a grid. A few years ago, I visited an old logging road in Montana, and for many decades, logging trucks had transported the seeds of this invasive thistle in the treads of their tires, and then all of that thistle bloomed at once, basically, after a rainstorm. And now there's this eerie purple linear stripe running through the landscape. Roads are zones of erosion. Here's another question for you. Who is the single largest road manager on Earth? Who has more roads under its jurisdiction than any other entity? Any guesses there? The United States, what agency specifically? The Forest Service, yeah. The U.S. Forest Service has 370,000 miles of road, which means that you could drive to the moon and most of the way back on Forest Service roads. There are forests in Idaho and Montana that have higher road densities than New York City. Most of those roads are old logging roads. They're obsolete. They're unsurfaced, right? They're dirt roads, so they don't get a lot of traffic. But you get a big rainstorm or snow melt event, and all of those dirt roads turn liquid, right, and just hemorrhage sediment into streams, and really smother fish eggs and impact water quality. So just because a road is in the middle of nowhere and doesn't see more than a dozen cars in a year doesn't mean that it's not having immense hydrological and even geological impacts. Zones are sources of pollution. Our cars are constantly bleeding cadmium and zinc and copper and microplastics and all kinds of stuff into the environment. A few years ago, scientists at the University of Washington analyzed many decades of salmon die-offs in the Puget Sound watershed and found that they'd been caused by 6-PPD, which is an obscure chemical in tires. And something like 6 million tons of tire particles enter our watersheds every year, and we're killing salmon on a pretty massive scale. And this is a chemical that nobody had ever heard of, right? And so, we're learning more all the time about those chemical impacts on nature of our highway network. One of those chemical impacts is road salt, right? We apply something like 20 million tons of road salt as a de-icing agent to our highways every year. A lot of that salt runs off into water bodies. Something like half the lakes in the Midwest are basically turning brackish over time because of road salt. We also turn our highways into salt licks, right? Animals are attracted to salt, which creates really dangerous situations for critters and drivers. I will say that the road salt issue inspired my favorite road sign in Jasper National Park. Every winter you can see signs saying, "Do not let moose lick your car." And I'm not sure you could stop a moose from licking your car. I think if a moose wants to lick a car, he's probably going to do it. But those are the kinds of weird, novel interactions that our roads create. Roads are these lands of noise, right? Our engines and tires are producing noise pollution constantly, which in a sense is a form of habitat loss. If you're a western meadowlark who has to sing to attract a mate, but your prospective mate can't hear you over the noise of engines and tires, you fundamentally can't live in that place, right? So a road might only be 150 feet wide from shoulder to shoulder, and yet the acoustic envelope that it's creating can span a mile or more. So that idea of road noise pollution as habitat loss, I think, is a really powerful one. I'll add, too, that road noise pollution is one of the great public health crises of our time, elevating our blood pressures, cortisol levels, risks of stroke and heart disease, and all kinds of maladies. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? Roads, yes, they destroy ecosystems, but they also create ecosystems to some extent, or at least they create niches for some species. Animals are endlessly flexible and creative and adaptive, and they're really good at taking advantage of the opportunities that our concrete jungle creates for them. I was in Minnesota a few years ago and visited this highway overpass, and on the underside of the overpass were all of these crevices, and there were hundreds of little brown bats roosting in the crevices, taking advantage of this novel ecosystem we created for them. Another example of that is our scavengers, right? We've basically turned our highways into these linear trails of carcasses for ravens and magpies and coyotes and golden eagles and bald eagles. So that's potentially a really beneficial resource, especially for golden eagles, which are sort of obligate scavengers in winter in particular. But of course, if you're an eagle with a belly full of venison, it's hard to achieve liftoff, right? And it's you're at risk of becoming roadkill yourself. And in fact, thousands of eagles are killed by cars every year. So the road, yes, it's this ecosystem, it's this resource, but it's also a profoundly dangerous novel ecosystem. And of course, these interactions between vehicles and wildlife are also dangerous to us as drivers, right? Here's a not so fun fact for you. The single most dangerous wild animal in North America is the white-tailed deer, right? That's not the deer's fault, that's the car's fault. But I think it's kind of an incredible testament to just how common and problematic these intersections between cars and animals are. There are up to 2 million deer vehicle collisions every year, which is something like a collision every 30 seconds or so. So there'll be dozens of deer vehicle collisions during the time that we're having this conversation. The average deer collision costs more than $9,000 in hospital bills, vehicle repairs, insurance costs, so on. Annually, annual collisions cost society more than $8 billion. And again, more than 400 drivers are killed every year in deer vehicle collisions, making deer the most dangerous wild animal. And of course, it's not just deer that are out there, right? There are other, large-bodied animals that cause problems as well. The average elk collision costs society more than $21,000. All of those car-licking moose, the average moose collision costs more than $40,000, right? So lots of large, problematic animals out there, which of course we're killing and are also creating safety hazards for drivers as well. And I'll add that from the animal's standpoint, the collision, the moment of impact between car and vehicle is really only half the problem. And for many migratory species in particular, the kind of the barrier effect that roads create is an even bigger impact than collisions themselves. And one of the kind of the case studies I think that illustrates that point are mule deer, specifically this herd of mule deer who live in the Red Desert in southwest Wyoming. And these are migratory mule deer. They walk about 300 miles round trip between their winter range and their summer habitat up in the mountains every year. Scientists have put satellite collars on them so they know exactly where they go and where they like to hang out. And what they found very clearly is that those deer never cross I-80, right? So here's a map of mule deer winter range in southwest Wyoming. The purple blobs are where the deer hang out, and this white line is I-80, right? And what you see very clearly is that those deer essentially never cross the interstate, and they're really not even trying, right? There's such a constant wall of vehicles rolling down that highway that it's essentially an impenetrable barrier to animal movement, right? A moving fence of cars, as some scientists say. And that's a big problem because all of the really good winter range is south of the interstate. So during harsh winters, those deer will basically pool up on the north side of that highway looking for a gap in traffic that never arrives. And 40% of that herd can actually starve during harsh winters, right? So that's a bigger problem in a sense than roadkill itself. A herd of 1,000 deer can survive a few collisions on the highway. What they can't survive is that habitat fragmentation, right? Losing access to all of that really good winter range south of the highway. Here's another kind of depressing map that I think illustrates much the same idea. These are mountain lion locations in Southern California, just west of Los Angeles. These red lines are the freeways, the 101, the 405, some of the busiest freeways on Earth. Every little collection of dots are the locations of individual mountain lions. And what you see very clearly is that those mountain lions never cross the freeways, right? All of the yellow dots are on the south side of the 101. All of the red dots are on the north side of the 101. And as a result, those mountain lions can't mingle and mate and exchange their genes, right? The cats that are basically trapped in the Santa Monica Mountains here are stuck mating with their own daughters, granddaughters, great-granddaughters. They've become incredibly inbred over time. They've begun to suffer genetic defects, and they've entered what scientists have called an extinction vortex, this kind of long-term doom spiral caused by the isolation imposed upon them by freeways. So we have these two kind of linked or related problems, right? We've got all of these wildlife vehicle collisions, these really dangerous crashes involving animals and people that are killing both them and us. And we have that habitat fragmentation, right? The fact that animals can't complete their movements across the landscape and are blinking out as a result. So how do we solve those two related problems? And really the best tool at our disposal are wildlife crossing structures, right? Overpasses, underpasses, bridges, culverts, all of these different sort of passageways that basically allow animals to safely move around the landscape and complete their journeys. So this concept of creating dedicated infrastructure for animals, really originated in Western Europe in the 1950s. France built the first wildlife crossings, followed by Germany, Austria, Switzerland. Today, the Netherlands is really the best at doing this sort of thing. The Dutch are just famously great engineers at everything. So here's a Dutch overpass crossing two highways, a railroad track, a sports complex, and a business park, a kilometer-long overpass. One of the reasons I was excited to come here is that the first wildlife overpass in the U.S. Was built in Utah over I-15 in 1975 near Beaver, and that was built for a herd of migratory mule deer that were getting hit on the highway. And in general, mule deer made for really good early test cases for wildlife crossings in the United States. Utah built the first overpass, again followed by Wyoming and Colorado, these intermountain states that have large herds of migratory ungulates, right? We've got thousands of mule deer and elk and antelope moving along these very predictable seasonal pathways across the landscape. So when 1,000 mule deer cross a highway in Wyoming every single spring, pretty soon there's this big pile of carcasses saying, hey, put the wildlife crossing right here, right? So those migratory ungulates in the Intermountain West are relatively straightforward animals to mitigate for and represented really most of those early wildlife crossings. Those were kind of the target species there. Another important lesson that road ecologists learned pretty quickly about how to mitigate for these wildlife vehicle collisions is the importance of fencing, right? People always say, how do the animals know to use the wildlife crossings, right? And the answer is the fences basically make them. You fence the highway on either side of those passages. Those migratory mule deer encounter that fence line, and they basically pace the fence line until they find the passageway, right? And then they use it. So those two elements, the crossings and the fences, really work hand in hand. They don't work without each other. The fences keep the animals off the highway and prevent the collisions, and the passages allow these journeys, these migrations, to continue safely and reconnect those habitats. And I think a point of emphasis over time has become providing a diversity of wildlife crossings, right? We know that every animal has its own ecological niche, its own habitat requirements, and likewise they have their own wildlife crossing requirements, right? Some animals, like mountain lions, for example, are totally content using an underpass. Mule deer are the same way. Some animals like pronghorn or elk prefer going over highways. There are all kinds of smaller critters out there that you have to account for. So here's a good example of that. This is a wildlife overpass on I-90 in Washington State, just outside of Seattle. Overpass built primarily for elk, but gets used by lots of other creatures as well. But here, in the ecosystem, they also have snakes and rodents and lizards and western toads and all kinds of smaller animals as well. So what they did was essentially bolt in all of these log structures, sometimes called faunal furniture, onto the deck of the bridge, basically providing sort of microhabitat features for those smaller animals to use as well, right? So historically, we've been very focused on mitigating for large ungulates in North America, the animals that most endanger driver safety when we hit them. But now transportation agencies are providing accommodations for some of those smaller creatures as well. Here's yet another example of that. This is an underpass for wildlife on I-90, also in Washington State. And up there, up on Snoqualmie Pass, the place where this is situated, they've got pikas. Pikas are little rabbit cousins who live in talus slopes. And so they actually built sort of an artificial talus slope leading through the underpass, which the pikas can follow back and forth, along with rodents and reptiles and all kinds of other smaller creatures as well. And they've also built lots of enlarged culverts, right? Culverts are, any pipe that conveys water under a roadway, and by widening those box culverts, you can provide crossing opportunities for otters and beavers and salamanders and all of these riparian associated animals, these aquatic animals as well. So again, just providing different structure types for different potential crossers fragmented by highways. I think that's really become a point of emphasis among some transportation agencies. Of course, one of the challenges is that it's not always possible to provide multiple crossings in a given stretch of highway, right? Due to land use on either side of the crossing, or the topography, or just the amount of money that a transportation agency has at its disposal. And so sometimes a single crossing has to suffice for the whole system. Where's this wildlife crossing? Anybody recognize this guy? Where's that? Yeah, this is I-80. This is Parley's Summit, kind of a famous project. I don't want to say this is controversial exactly, but certainly I've heard many road ecologists say ideally this thing would be a heck of a lot wider. Right now it's kind of like a catwalk. And I definitely heard from some scientists who were skeptical that this sort of thing would ever be used by wildlife. But in fact, as many of you know, this crossing has been seemingly very successful. Has seen all kinds of use from moose, elk, coyotes, deer. I think that's a bobcat, raccoon. Maybe that's a marmot. I'm not even sure what that is. So again, this is a situation where I think due to budgetary constraints, UDOT basically had to build a single crossing, relatively narrow, but animals are finding it and using it, and it does seem to be doing its job. There's a nice mountain lion. So that structure, that Parley's Canyon overpass, I think that was something like $5.5 million, which in the realm of wildlife crossings is actually not a huge price tag. These days, typical overpass is $8 to $10 million. But I do think that because overpasses tend to be the most visible wildlife crossings out there, we sometimes get this false impression that accommodating wildlife is necessarily very expensive, right? That we have to build these, $10 million overpasses to help animals. And certainly, we should build a whole lot more large wildlife crossings for those bigger critters. But, I'll also add that there are lots of smaller scale, cheaper opportunities to improve habitat connectivity for wildlife as well. So here's one neat example of that. This is a culvert in Montana on Highway 93. Just a little sort of seasonal passage for the conveyance of water that animals kind of commandeered and, was getting used by bobcats and weasels and skunks and all kinds of, kind of mesocarnivores. The problem is that, because this culvert is situated at a seasonal wetland. In spring, the water comes up, the culvert's half flooded, and animals can't use it, right? So here, the Montana Department of Transportation installed what they call a critter shelf, right? This little metal catwalk that allows animals to still use that culvert, even when that underpass is half flooded. So again, not every wildlife accommodation has to be, a big, conspicuous, beautiful $10 million bridge, right? There's a lot we can do with the existing infrastructure that's already on the landscape. Here's another example of that. This is an old box culvert in Virginia under I-64. This was built not for wildlife, again, just for the seasonal movement of water and livestock. But here a few years ago, the Department of Transportation basically had the bright idea of fencing either side of that culvert, right? If you put fences along the culvert, you can basically funnel animals to that passage and force them to use it as a wildlife crossing, right? So that's what VDOT did, and they saw more than a 90% reduction in deer vehicle collisions, a fourfold increase in deer usage of that culvert, because again, you're just forcing animals to cross the road through that passageway. And I think, most important from the transportation department's perspective is that they actually recouped those project costs in under 2 years, right? We were talking earlier about how dangerous and expensive those deer vehicle collisions are. Well, if you can install fencing that prevents a few dozen of those every year, right, you can recover your own costs very quickly. And I think that's an important point about wildlife crossings, is that there's plenty of research basically demonstrating very clearly that yes, they're good conservation policy, but they're also good fiscal policy, right? That we can save the public a whole lot of money pretty quickly by installing these crossings. Here's a wildlife overpass on Highway 9 in Colorado that paid for its own construction costs in under 5 years through collision prevention. Of course, the corollary to that is that, again, we've tended to take this very cost-benefit focused approach to wildlife mitigation, right? We build crossings for the deer and the elk and the antelope and the moose, the big mammals that mess you up when you hit them. The issue is that nobody's ever totaled their car hitting northern red-legged frogs or garter snakes or those smaller reptiles and amphibians. But those amphibians in particular are some of the most road-endangered organisms out there, right? Those amphibians are making seasonal migrations between upland breeding habitat and breeding wetlands, or upland kind of forest habitat and their breeding grounds. And typically roads separate those two habitats, and so you get these these big kind of mass squishing events that are wiping out many frog and salamander and turtle populations. And so certainly we need a lot more amphibian crossings out there. Again, it's just hard to convince state agencies to pay several $1 million for frog crossings, right? So, yes, let's build more deer and elk passages, but let's also start thinking about those smaller animals as well that aren't human safety concerns, but certainly are conservation concerns. And we just need a lot more of these crossings in more ambitious places as well, right? I mentioned earlier those mountain lions in Southern California who are sort of fragmented and inbred due to freeways. Well, as you probably know, the world's largest wildlife crossing is being built right now in Southern California for those mountain lions, specifically over the 101. This is a rendering. It'll be completed in early 2026, and that crossing is going to span 10 lanes of traffic, conveying 300,000 cars a day, right? The busiest freeway on Earth. So if you can build a wildlife crossing over that thing, you can build one basically anywhere. And I think we need to start reevaluating the kinds of projects that are possible. Fortunately, we have more money for wildlife crossings and sort of wildlife roadway mitigation in general than we've ever had. The 2021 Bipartisan Infrastructure Act included something called the Wildlife Crossings Pilot Program, a $350 million competitive grant program in which states and tribes basically compete for funding for wildlife crossings. Utah's already gotten a bunch of that money. Utah is really one of the better states when it comes to this sort of thing. Utah also allocated $20 million annually in state funding for wildlife passages, which also helps it compete for that federal funding. So, pat yourselves on the back for that. So that all sounds impressive, right? $350 million is a lot of money. Of course, the same Federal Infrastructure Act included $110 billion for highway expansion projects that will make a lot of these problems a heck of a lot worse, right? So, in a sense, we're spending more money on wildlife accommodations than we ever had. On the other hand, we're spending sort of a tiny fraction of really what this problem deserves, and certainly very little in the context of immense federal and state transportation budgets. And I'll point out that in some ways I think there are countries out there that are better than us when it comes to this sort of thing. In part I think because look, when we built our massive federal interstate highway system in the mid-20th century, we didn't quite understand the impacts of roads on nature. And now we're stuck with this kind of calcified infrastructural system that, yes, we can tweak and retrofit in various ways, but most of our historic ecological mistakes, I think, are more or less set in stone. Whereas other countries, I think, are more creative. They're building out their infrastructure now, in a sense, and so they can learn from our mistakes and do things right the first time. This is an overpass built for a red crab migration on Christmas Island. Millions of crabs moving seasonally between their upland and beach spawning habitat. Brazil, for example, a country that's probably building new highways faster than any other nation on earth, has laws requiring the inclusion of wildlife accommodations in any new highway project, right? That's certainly more than we can say in the US. India is building highways in some places on elevated concrete pillars, which basically allow animals like tigers to wander the forest floor unimpeded, below these highways for many miles, right? And that I talked to one Indian conservationist who told me that basically increases project costs sixfold. So good luck getting UDOT to do that, right? But that is the kind of the sort of cool, thoughtful, creative thing you can do, when you're building your infrastructure from scratch. So, ultimately, both the challenge and the opportunity before us, is to remake our infrastructure to save biodiversity. No pressure, right? But, again, we know that we're in the middle of this sixth mass extinction event in planetary history, this enormous biodiversity crisis. And as I said at the start of this conversation, roads are perhaps the leading cause of that, right? There's literally nothing that we do that kills more animals than drive. Here's one example of that. This is an underpass in South Texas built for ocelots. Texas is home to the last 100 or so ocelots in the U.S., and road collisions are 40% of ocelot mortality. That's an animal that we're losing right now because we're not allowing it to safely cross roads, right? So if we're going to keep ocelots and a whole lot of other critters around, throughout the Anthropocene, this human-dominated age, we have to reckon with the impact of our infrastructure. And of course, roads are also these enormous social costs for us humans. Yes, they're incredibly useful. We use them to get to schools and hospitals and grocery stores. I've driven thousands of miles promoting my book about the ills of driving. So certainly there's lots of social utility to roads, but there are also lots of social costs as well. This is I-81 in Syracuse, New York, a highway that was built in the 1950s and 60s, very deliberately through a historic black neighborhood that white officials wanted to essentially eradicate. Today, Syracuse is the most segregated city in the country because I-81, this kind of sun-blotting viaduct, divides the white and black communities. Syracuse also suffers immense air quality problems, noise pollution issues, and certainly you could tell that same story about Minneapolis or Los Angeles or Miami or 1,000 other American cities. And excitingly, I think, Syracuse is in the middle of taking this viaduct down, actually removing this monstrosity and replacing it with a kind of a street-level boulevard with housing and small businesses. So, we can still, reckon with and reverse some of our most egregious environmental and social mistakes. So ultimately, the last sort of thought that I wanted to very briefly leave you with is that my interest in this topic really began in 2013. I was in Montana, and I had a chance to take a tour of some wildlife crossings on Highway 93 north of Missoula, and those crossings were basically built at the behest of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, the native people through whose land that highway runs. And they essentially said to the Montana Department of Transportation and USDOT that the road should be a visitor to this land, not a conqueror of the land. Right? We talked earlier about how roads were were these tools or instruments of colonialism, that John Calhoun and others viewed them as tools of conquer, right? And so the tribes said very explicitly, we want roads to be visitors rather than dominators of the landscape, and that to them, building wildlife crossings was a part of accomplishing that, of making the road, if not totally benign, at least less catastrophic. So that's the kind of the provocation I'd love to leave you with. What does it mean for a road to be a visitor to a place, and how do we achieve that? So with that, I'll say thank you all so much for being here this afternoon, and I'm very happy to take a few questions.
Thank you so much for a really informative presentation. I want to thank Ben for being here. I also want to thank our programs in American Studies and in Global Environmental Studies, which are co-sponsoring this lecture. We do have about 15 minutes to invite you into the conversation. We will finish at 1, but if you do have a question you'd like to ask Ben, please raise your hand. We've got microphones that will come to you. And we ask you to stand and tell us your name. If you're a student here, tell us what you study. If you're faculty or staff or from the public as well, feel free to introduce yourself briefly. And we will conclude at 1 o'clock.
Hi, my name is Andre. I'm a psychology major. I had a question. You mentioned that 4 million miles of roads exist in the United States, 40 million across the world. Are we to understand that those are just paved roads like we see here, or do those include footpaths? Like, what is the scope of that metric?
Yeah, the $4 million figure in the U.S. Includes unpaved roads, so things like the Forest Service roads, BLM roads, all of those unpaved public lands roads. I think the U.S. has, I want to say, 2.8 million miles of paved road. Worldwide, that 40 million mile figure is very much a ballpark estimate that. I don't even know where that number comes from exactly, because obviously a lot of countries, and of course, so many roads are built illegally or without official authorization, right? There's something like 100,000 miles of illegal logging roads in the Amazon rainforest alone, and so getting a handle on how many roads are out there is actually a much more difficult problem than you might imagine.
My name is Spencer Klump. I'm a Mesa major. I was just curious, what are some other leading countries who are taking measures to try to protect wildlife and kind of coexist more with nature, like along their roads? Are there any other countries who are building overpasses like we are here in the States, or other places like that?
Yeah, certainly. There are. Australia's done a lot for wildlife. At this point, you can see wildlife crossings all over the place. Singapore has a very famous and I think pretty effective one. Argentina built one recently. Croatia, oddly enough, is sort of one of the world's leaders. One country I'll call out because I just talked to somebody from there, and he was telling me a bit about their laws. Is Nepal. Nepal is another country like India, that's building out its highway network fairly rapidly, including through some protected areas that are home to elephants and tigers and rhinos and other critters, and that's obviously not ideal. But they are at least nominally, doing that in a way that avoids some of the most important habitats, and they're building. They also, like Brazil, have laws requiring the construction of wildlife crossings with any new highway project. So yeah, there are certainly other countries out there that are doing a lot of cool stuff.
Hi, I'm Ellie Roberts. I'm studying finance at BYU. I was just wondering, are these wildlife crossings working as well as they were expected to? Have we seen a significant decrease in roadkill, where there are wildlife crossings, and does it help the migration as well as you were expecting?
Yeah, absolutely. So typically when wildlife crossings and fences are installed, what you basically always see is more than an 80% reduction in roadkill, and reductions of these days, 95% or so are fairly common, right? So we're nearly totally eliminating roadkill, which is great. And of course, the animals are using them, right? That's most, in some ways, most important. So typically, the way that's measured is with passage rate. It's essentially, rhodocalists they'll put sort of trail cams, near wildlife crossings, and then you can essentially measure how many of the animals that approach a wildlife crossing actually go through it, right? Because you can imagine that if you're, a deer approaching a box culvert, maybe you're thinking, wait a second, what is this strange, unfamiliar tunnel? This is not super inviting, and maybe you'll turn around. Well, fortunately, what seems to happen is that within several years, the animals basically totally acclimate to wildlife crossings. There was a cool study in Wyoming a few years ago where they installed wildlife crossings and then looked at passage rate and found that the first year that the wildlife crossings were in place, about half of the deer that approached the crossings went through them. The second year is about 75%, and the third year is about 95%, right? So pretty much the entire herd had learned that, yes, these things are safe, they're familiar now. A lot of learning happens within animal herds, right? The fawns learning from their mothers, and the cubs learning from adult bears. We see that sort of thing a lot. So yeah, animals use them. They prevent collisions. They've been generally extremely effective and successful.
Hello. Hi, I'm Catherine, and my major is Asian Studies, and I was just wondering, on like an individual level, what would you recommend for us to do to better reduce those negative impacts of our roads on the ecosystem? Like, are there, say, organizations that we can donate to, or just any like daily habits that you would recommend that we could help with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that in terms of daily habits, the thing that I always tell people and to try and sometimes fail to implement myself is to just drive less at night, right? Obviously, night is just this kind of critical movement period for a lot of species. It's also a time, of course, when your own visibility and reaction time is dramatically reduced. So, if you can avoid driving at night, I think that's the best thing we can do behaviorally. But I know that's hard to accomplish, and I fail to accomplish that myself. So I think this is one of those. It's sort of like climate change, right? This is one of those issues that yes, certainly human behavior is part of it, but just as changing our collective light bulbs is not going to solve climate change. I am not so naive as to think that you can convince Americans to dramatically change their driving habits out of the goodness of their hearts. So to me, this is really an infrastructural problem, right? It's about creating more walkable, bikeable communities that require driving less, and building wildlife crossings in more rural areas where some amount of driving is unavoidable. So who's working on that? Locally, I'd say there's a great group called the Wildlands Network, which is based in Salt Lake City, or at least has offices there. They've done a lot on the kind of the federal policy level, trying to kind of embed wildlife planning into state and federal policymaking and rulemaking and budgets. And then it is. Look, one of the cool things about the wildlife crossing issue in general is that it's very nonpartisan, right? I had this slide up at the end that basically, according to one public opinion poll that was conducted in Colorado, 86% of residents support more wildlife crossings, right? And you see the same numbers in Nevada, Oregon, Utah, every Western state. This is truly a nonpartisan thing that broadly unites the hunting lobby and the Humane Society, right, in a way that few other environmental issues do. And so, it's an easy thing, I think, for your elected officials to get behind. It truly is nonpartisan. I mean, the Wildlife Crossings pilot program and the Infrastructure Act, that was, originally written by John Barrasso, Republican senator in Wyoming. I mean, how much environmental legislation has been sponsored by, Republicans from Wyoming in the last, 20 years? Not a ton. So just to say that, this is one of those things that elected officials are really responsive to, right? And if you do the good citizen thing and write to your county commission, your representatives, they're generally responsive to that. And, there are lots of examples, some of them in the book, of communities that have, documented roadkill hotspots, talked to their representatives, and basically achieved results.
I'm Allie Acey. I'm the coordinator of the Stewardship Lab. I was curious about if there's a difference in impact on wildlife for things like trains or alternative transportation overland to highways. I can't think of anything other than trains. I'm sure there is something.
Hovercrafts, yeah.
Hovercraft, yeah, obviously. But I'm curious if there's like a difference in impact on not only roadkill, but like habitat and connection and how animals react to that.
Yeah, good question. Certainly, look, trains are good, right? Anything we can do to get people out of cars and and into transit is positive. But trains are also not benign, right? There's plenty of train kill, in part because trains can't really stop, right? Unlike cars. And certainly there have been just mass killings of pronghorn and elk and other sort of herds of ungulates that congregate along train tracks. One very common problem we see is lots of train tracks are conveying grain, and that grain gets spilled, and that becomes a major attractant and a hazard for wildlife. So there's a lot of the train mitigation work has actually gone into preventing grain spillage, which is a really serious problem. Not a problem with passenger rail, obviously, but an issue nonetheless. Yeah, I'd say that broadly, kind of the mitigation tactics for trains look a lot like the mitigation tactics for highways. Right now there's high-speed rail being built in the California desert, and they're including 3 overpasses for bighorn sheep, along this high-speed rail network. So, not as dramatic a problem as highways, but still a problem that requires mitigation.
Okay. Hi, I'm Leah. I study biology, and I was wondering, we were talking a lot about like the big interstates and overpasses solutions there.
Yeah.
Is it as much of a problem in like suburban areas, urban areas? Are there projects being worked on there, or is it just mostly a problem out on the big interstate highways?
No, it's a really good question. I would say that the big interstate highways are where most of the mitigation has been done, or less so the big interstates and more actually the sort of the more rural 2-lane state highways. That's where we see a lot of this mitigation. The big interstates ironically have so much traffic that animals don't try to cross them very often, so there's generally not a lot of roadkill along interstates compared to smaller state highways, right? So as a result, the very cost-benefit focused transportation agencies don't build crossings on the interstates because they say, oh well, there's not a lot of roadkill here, so what's the big deal? I-80 in Parley's Canyon being an exception to that. Anyway, the thing about suburban areas where there's still plenty of roadkill, the problem that you have there is that you just don't have a lot of land to connect, right? All of these little parcels are owned by, private landowners, and it's hard to get a private landowner to build a wildlife crossing in their backyard, or to allow an agency to do that, right? Typically, wildlife crossings are being built in places where they span and connect big blocks of Forest Service or BLM or other public land habitat. You don't really have that in suburban areas, even though you often still have a lot of wildlife. Kind of a cool case study in Utah right now is the town of Eagle Mountain, which is one of the fastest growing cities in the American West, basically built right on top of a historic mule deer migration corridor, and they're actually trying to sort of protect that migration corridor, including by building some very suburban wildlife crossings in Eagle Mountain. Still trying to get funding for that, but they're running into that problem, which is like, okay, right, how do you create a wildlife crossing in a neighborhood where there's private land on either side of the crossing? How do you get everybody on board and excited about doing that?
My name's Bethany Edgel. I'm a strategic management major. I used to live just north of Missoula, so I know exactly what you mean about that area. So what do you think about different tech initiatives that are being used to help solve this problem, like virtual fencing or like Volkswagen's like sound warning? Do you see those as a good direction that we're moving in, or does it just all come back to we still need more physical crossings?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I do think that ultimately autonomous vehicles will solve parts of these problems. I don't think the sound warnings work. I don't think the animals are really responsive to them. I do think that as AV technology gets better, I mean, I do think that we'll ultimately see a lot of these large ungulate collisions go down, right? 20 years from now, your self-driving Tesla is just going to be better at avoiding large animals at night than we fallible human drivers ever are. So that sounds nice. The problem is twofold. First, you're not solving that connectivity problem, right? A wall of self-driving Teslas does not permit deer migration, any more than a wall of, human-driven cars does. And also, you're not solving those smaller animal collisions with those self-driving vehicles as well, right? I brake for snakes and turtles. My robot chauffeur is not going to. I do think that ultimately fencing and crossings are kind of are going to remain the best tool in our toolbox for solving those dual problems of collisions with animals of all sizes and that loss of connectivity that roads impose.
But are the e-fences doing anything to help? Or are they...
The e-fences. Tell me about what do you mean by that?
It sounds like there's some initiatives to have more of like a virtual fence via with just like little warnings along the road or just anything to get them. Yeah.
Right. So I mean, a couple of versions of that have been tried, where basically you have like either acoustic warnings or visual warnings.
Or like shock or something.
Right. And I would say that the results on that are mixed. Maybe some impacts on roadkill reduction, but again, you're still not solving that connectivity problem, right? Because you're chasing the animals away from the highway. Ultimately, we need to give animals ways to cross roads, and wildlife crossings are kind of the best option there still.